"You'll regret it, we won't obey," the identical Chinese twin said when the rancher paid $6 for them at the auction. The winter sun was a pale wafer in the gray sky, its weak light doing little to warm the snow-covered hollow where every board, every stone seemed brittle with frost. At the center of town, two young Chinese women stood on the auction platform, their wrists bound tight. They were identical in every feature, their skin bruised beneath the noon glare, blood crusted at the corner of their mouths. Dressed in tattered, threadbare kyongsams that offered little protection from the biting cold, they stood barefoot in the snow. Yet their stares remained unbroken, cold, bright, and proud. Men gathered around, their laughter like the crack of frozen branches. "Won't last a week on a ranch," one spat, his breath a white plume in the frigid air. "Sell them for a cigar." "It's more than they're worth," another barked. Coins clinked. A half-empty bottle was waved as a bid. The auctioneer, a man named Barlow, grinned, his teeth yellowed. "They're wild, but still breathing. Who will start?" Then a single voice, steady and low, broke through the noise. $6. The square fell silent. $6 was barely the price of a new pair of winter boots or one night's drink at the saloon. The crowd roared with laughter at the foolishness. Through the falling snow stepped Elias Thorne, a local rancher, his coat dusty and worn, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He laid 6 silver coins on the table. "Not buying them," he said. "Just buying your mercy." He cut the ropes. The two women met his gaze, their voices a synchronized whisper. "You'll regret it." "We won't obey you. I've regretted worse," he answered. "Not today." The sun sank early over the snow-laden hollow, leaving the town wrapped in an icy haze. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and damp wool. The two things that kept men alive here or killed them faster. Saloons leaned against one another like drunks seeking warmth. Horses stamped in the snow-packed street, restless under the cold that intensified after dark. At the far edge of town stood a modest ranch, its fences stark against the snow. This was Elias Thorne's homestead. The lowing of a few cattle and the whistle of the wind through the eaves had replaced the heartbeat of a bustling life, for lately, things were quiet. Elias, the rancher, lived alone in the small house, a man of few words and fewer friends. He was broad-shouldered with hands calloused and scarred from years of rope and rain. The right side of his neck bore an old burn, twisted and pale, a souvenir from the war. He never spoke of it. People said he'd once been a soldier, maybe even a sergeant under a man named Alastair Finch before the army disbanded and men scattered like ash. Now, Finch ran wagons and trade goods, though everyone knew half of what he sold, breathed, and bled. That afternoon, when Elias paid $6 silver for the Chinese girls, folks in the town couldn't stop laughing. The fool paid for trouble, they said at the saloon, huddled around the pot-bellied stove. They'll cut his throat by dawn, but Elias didn't hear them. Or maybe he did and chose to let the noise pass like the wind. The girls, whose names he learned were Mai and Lee, now sat on the porch of his small ranch house, wrapped in heavy wool blankets he'd left by the door. They had muttered their names once, half asleep, as if reminding themselves who they were. Their wrists were raw from the ropes, the marks stark against their pale skin. He brought them 2 tin cups of steaming broth, said nothing, and went to tend to his horses. Inside the barn, the place smelled of hay, leather, and animals. The lantern's orange glow painted his face with a tired light. Every movement was measured, like penance. He didn't look at them, not until they spoke in unison from the doorway. "Why did you do it?" He kept working. "Because someone had to." They gave a dry laugh that held no mirth. "You think $6 buys back what they took?" He paused, his hand stroking a horse's muzzle. The flame flickered. "No," he said quietly. "But it stops one more wound." As dusk deepened, the first howl of a blizzard came down from the mountains. Elias stepped outside to latch the barn door and caught the faintest whiff of smoke. Not the clean kind from his chimney. This was wild, greasy, wrong. He turned toward the larger barn. Fire tore through the hay and the stalls in a breath, a stark, terrifying orange against the white landscape. The horses screamed. He ran for the snowpack buckets, shouting for help that wouldn't come. The town watched from porches and windows, the same way it had watched the girls' auction, amused, detached, safe in its cruelty. By the time the flames died, the barn was a black skeleton against the night, snow already beginning to cover the smoldering remains. Elias stood among the ashes, the heat a bizarre contrast to the freezing air. Behind him, the twins' voices came soft but steady. "We know who did this," he turned. They were staring into the smoke, their eyes reflecting the fire. "It's Finch," they said. "The one who bought and sold us. The one you once rode with." The night fell heavy between them, and for the first time in years, Elias Thorne felt the weight of a past he had tried to bury rising again from the flames. They left before dawn, the smoke from the burnt barn still clinging to the wind like a curse. Elias rode ahead, the reins loose in one hand, a rifle slung across his saddle. Behind him, Mayan Lee followed on a mare he'd barely managed to save from the fire. They rode with straight backs, silent, strips of cloth covering the wounds on their wrists. Neither spoke for miles. The land spread endless and white around them, brittle, snow-covered mesquite, frozen gullies, and far-off ridges blurred by the ever-present snowfall. Somewhere behind those ridges lay a basin where Elias meant to start again, or maybe finish what he should have long ago. When the sun climbed higher, a weak, hazy orb, the twins broke the silence. "You didn't have to bring us." "I didn't," he said without turning. "You followed." Their voices were sharp, like ice cracking. "You think we trust you? I don't need you." To the horses' hooves thudded softly over the snow-covered earth. For a while, there was only the wind and the faint creak of leather. Then they spoke again. "Finch. He burned my village. He sold my people." Elias's shoulders stiffened, but he said nothing. "We saw his face that night," they went on, their eyes fixed on his back. "And the soldiers who followed him. Were you one of them?" He didn't answer. The silence was louder than a confession. By noon, they reached the rim of a canyon where the trail split into two narrow passes, both treacherous with ice and snow. Elias dismounted, studying the tracks in the snow. "We'll take the northern route, less open ground, more hiding places," they said. "For them or for you?" He looked at them then, really looked. The grime on their cheeks couldn't hide the fierce steadiness in their eyes. "You'll live longer if you stop thinking everyone's your enemy." "Everyone is," they replied and nudged their horse past him. That night, they made camp beneath a cluster of snow-laden cottonwoods. The sky above was a clear, cold black, pricked with hard stars. Elias gathered wood in silence, while Mayan Lee crouched nearby, sharpening a piece of scrap metal into a crude blade. When sparks rose from his flint, they flinched. He noticed. "You've seen too many fires," they glared. "So have you." And neither spoke after that. The wind moaned through the branches, carrying the smell of ash and old ghosts. Before dawn, the sound of hooves woke them both. Elias reached for his rifle, motioning for them to stay down, but they were already moving, silent as shadows. From the ridge above, two riders appeared, torches flickering against the snow. Finch's men. Elias fired once, hitting a torch, not the man. The flames dropped, scattering sparks into a snowdrift. The riders bolted into the dark, shouting curses. When the last echo faded, Elias leaned against a boulder, his breath ragged. Blood darkened his sleeve. "You're hit," the twins said, kneeling beside him. "It's nothing, don't lie." They tore a strip from their tattered keong sams, pressing it to the wound. Their fingers were firm, quick, unafraid. "Hold still." They had gathered pine needles, crushing them to make a poultice to stop the bleeding. His voice came low, strained. "You've done this before for others," they said. "Not for men like you." He tried to speak again, but his words tangled into a groan. Fever climbed fast. They laid him down near the fire, watching his face twist in pain. Then, in the half-light, he muttered through clenched teeth words they weren't meant to hear. "I burned it. The camp." Children were inside. They froze. The world seemed to fall silent except for his ragged breathing. By morning, the fever had broken. He opened his eyes to find them sitting a few feet away, the knife across their knees, staring at the horizon. "You heard," he said. They didn't look at him. "We did, then why am I still breathing?" Their voices were steady, almost weary. "Because mercy isn't obedience, and hate doesn't feed the thirsty," he said, nothing more. The winter wind moved between them, cold, dry, and alive. That day, when they rode on, they no longer followed 10 paces behind. They rode beside him. The trail carried them deeper into the basin, where the land shimmered white beneath the cold sun. Days blurred together, snow by daylight, bitter cold by night. Every breath tasted of iron and frost. Yet between the stretches of silence, something fragile began to form. An unspoken rhythm. A quiet endurance shared by two people who had run out of places to hide. Elias rarely spoke unless he needed to. He rode with the same careful control he used to manage his herd. Careful, controlled, a man afraid of sudden things. Mai and Lee moved differently, alert, fluid, their eyes scanning the horizon like hawks. Sometimes they rode ahead, scouting for danger. Sometimes they simply wanted space. One morning, while he mended a broken rein, they crouched nearby, watching his practiced hands. "You work like you're praying," they said. He didn't glance up. "Maybe I am to who?" He paused. Not sure he listens anymore, they smiled faintly, not in mockery, but in recognition. "Then you understand the gods we know," their voices faded into the hum of the winter wind. The world around them was vast but no longer empty. At dusk, they reached a frozen stream where faint water trickled beneath the ice. Elias broke through the surface, coaxing out a slow seep of brown water. Mai and Lee crouched beside him, letting the icy water numb their wrists. "You could have left us," they said suddenly. "I tried," he admitted. "Then why didn't you?" He met their gaze, steady and tired. "Because when you look at me, I see everything I ran from." They studied him for a long moment, then turned away. "That's not a good reason, it's the truth," he said. The wind rose, carrying a swirl of snow between them. For a heartbeat, the tension cracked into something almost tender. 2 days later, they crossed a stretch of salt flats that glowed white under the sun. Elias's sleeve was stiff with dried blood, his wound healing slowly. Mai and Lee insisted on cleaning it each night, their hands steady, even when his breath hissed through his teeth. "Your people taught you this?" he asked once. "Yes," they said. Before they were scattered, he watched them wrap the bandage with careful precision. "You were healers," their eyes flickered. "We were daughters," that was all they said. But in the way their fingers lingered at the knot, he could almost feel the ghost of a childhood stolen too soon. By the 4th night, they reached the foothills of a snow-capped mountain range. The air was thinner here, the rocks turning black and jagged under the moonlight. Elias slowed his horse as they approached the broken ruins of an old military outpost, its walls half buried in snow. The crumbled walls and rusted gates still bore the insignia of the regiment he'd once served under. He stopped, staring at the collapsed barracks. "I knew this place," the twins' voices were low. "The men who burned my village wore that same mark." He said nothing, only dismounted and walked to the base of a shattered flagpole. His hand brushed the iron ring still dangling from the rope. The sound it made was hollow, like the echo of a past that refused to die. They watched him for a long while, then asked, "Why did you follow orders like that?" He didn't turn. "Because I was too young to know what cowardice looked like, and now I know it by name." Their eyes met across the ruins, heavy with truths neither could soften. They made camp in a narrow ravine, sheltered from the wind. The firelight flickered over their faces, one weathered, one scarred by survival. Elias sat sharpening his old knife. Mai and Lee sat near the edge of the firelight, weaving thin strips of yucca into a cord. "Do you ever sleep?" they asked. "When the fire burns low, that's when the dead come," he said. They looked up. "Then maybe they still need something from us." His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. The fire popped. A few minutes later, they reached into their satchels and drew out a small, carved token, a piece of bone etched with a delicate lotus blossom. They turned it in their fingers before setting it beside him. Our father made this before they took us. Elias stared at the carving, then at them. Keep it. We don't need reminders, they said. He picked it up anyway and handed it back. Reminders keep you human. They took it, not to argue, but because his voice carried the same exhaustion they felt in their bones. When dawn broke, the desert beyond the mountains glowed in soft amber light against the snow. They ate in silence, packing their things before mounting their horse. The twins glanced toward him. You'll find him soon, they said. Finch, they nodded. And when you do, what? He hesitated. Maybe I'll see if redemption has a face. They studied him as if weighing the man against the words. If it does, it's never the one we expect. They rode on without speaking. The sun climbed. The land widened. And the distance between them finally began to feel less like a wall and more like a road. The path through the mountains twisted like a scar, narrow ledges carved by storms, cliffs blackened by old fires and now covered in snow. The air was thin, sharp as metal. Elias led his horse slowly through the rocks, his shoulder still stiff beneath his shirt. Mai and Lee followed close, their makeshift bow slung across their backs, eyes sweeping the ridges above. By the time they reached the canyon mouth, the light had turned copper. Elias crouched, touching the dirt beneath the snow. Boot prints, fresh. They're close, he said. Then we're too late, or too early, Mai and Lee murmured. They were right. A sudden echo of voices. For riders appeared from behind the ridge, rifles glinting. Finch's men. Elias pulled his gun but didn't fire. Stay behind the rocks. Mai and Lee ignored him. In one motion, they tore an arrow from their quiver, fitted it to the bow, and fired. The first rider fell with a cry, tumbling from his saddle into the snow. The others fired back, bullets sparking against stone. Elias fired once, twice, hitting the rifle of the second man, not his chest. Shoot to kill, they shouted. He reloaded calmly. I'm done killing. Her bullet grazed his thigh. He stumbled, rolling behind a boulder. Mai and Lee dropped beside him, their breath ragged. You'll die trying to be a saint. He looked at them, sweat running down his neck despite the cold. Better that than die as what I was. They fought until the canyon fell silent again. The wind returned, howling through the pass. 3 men lay still in the snow. One crawled away, clutching his arm, disappearing into the brush. Elias leaned against the rock, breathing hard, his rifle trembling slightly in his hand. You could have finished them, Mai and Lee said, wiping dust from their faces. He shook his head. You think blood answers blood? I thought so, too, until the day I watched it dry for a moment. Anger flickered in their eyes. But beneath it was something else, a recognition of the same torment that lived in them. They dragged the bodies into the ravine, covering them with loose stone and snow. When they returned to the trail, neither spoke for hours. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't distrust now, but something heavier, like mourning. By nightfall, they reached an abandoned trading post, half buried under sand and snow. The wooden sign creaked in the wind, letters nearly erased, Harlan Supply. Elias pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. Inside, the shelves were bare except for a few rusted cans and a broken lantern. He lit a small fire in the hearth. Mai and Lee moved through the shadows, searching. In a corner chest, they found a bundle wrapped in cloth. They unrolled it and froze. Inside lay a silver bracelet, tarnished but unmistakable, carved with the lotus blossom of their clan. Their fingers trembled as they lifted it. Elias stepped closer. That's yours. Their throats tightened. It was our mother's. He nodded. Then take it. They did. And for the first time since he'd met them, their eyes glistened. Why would you give it to me? Because you were meant to have it, he said simply. Not men like Finch. Not me. They turned the bracelet in their hands, the firelight catching its edge. You think this forgives you? He shook his head slowly. No, but maybe it lets me remember without lying. The wind outside rose again, whistling through the gaps in the boards. Mai and Lee sat beside the fire, clutching the bracelet like it might disappear if they let go. Their voices were a whisper. When we were children, our father told us the sun never dies. It only hides to rest. We used to believe him. Elias stirred the coals. Maybe he was right. Some of us just burn longer before we sleep. They sat there until the fire turned to embers. The night stretched quiet, but neither wanted to sleep. By morning, rumors had already begun to spread. In the nearby mining camps, men whispered of a white rancher traveling with 2 Chinese wolf girls, hunting Alastair Finch. Some said they'd bewitched him. Others swore he'd lost his mind to guilt. Either way, they were marked. At midday, a scout rode hard to warn Finch that the pair were coming. The old soldier-turned-traitor only laughed, his teeth yellow in the lamplight. "Elias Thorne," he said. "That coward's finally found his conscience." He poured himself another drink and muttered, "We'll see how long it lasts." The following evening, Elias, and Lee reached the edge of a rugged territory. The sky was bruised purple and red, the cliffs above the frozen river like molten glass. Beyond it, hidden among the boulders, smoke rose from a cluster of shacks. Finch knew stronghold. And Lee watched in silence, their jaws tight. "He's down there," Elias nodded. "And half a dozen men with him." They unslung their bow. "Then we end it tonight." He caught their wrists. "No, not like this." Their eyes flared. "You'd let him live." "I'd let you live," he said, his voice rough. "Killing him won't free you from him." "It never does." They pulled away, trembling. "He killed our father. Sold our mother, our brother." "I know," Elias said. "And I helped him once. But if you spill his blood, you'll carry his shadow." "I've carried it long enough." They looked at him then, truly looked, seeing not the man who'd once served Finch, but the one who'd chosen to face him now. The firelight caught the silver bracelet on their wrists. Their hands lowered. "Then we finish this your way," Elias exhaled slowly, like a man finally stepping out of his own grave. That night, a storm gathered over the desert. Lightning flickered beyond the ridges, thunder rolling like drums of war as they crept down toward the river camp. The wind tore at their coats, carrying sand and the smell of rain somewhere below. Finch's men were laughing over a fire, unaware that the ghosts of their past were walking straight toward them. The storm broke just before midnight. Rain fell in slanted sheets, hissing against rock and river alike. Through the blur of lightning, Elias, and Lee moved like shadows down the slope toward Finch's camp. A half-collapsed shack stood at the river's edge, lamplight leaking through its cracks. Inside, voices rose above the storm, Finch's rasping laugh among them. Elias crouched behind a boulder, water dripping from his hat. "We go quiet," he whispered. "We need the ledger, his records. It'll show every name, every sailor." And Lee nodded, but their jaws were set hard. Their bow was ready, eyes gleaming with the reflection of lightning. They slipped closer. 2 guards sat near the door, rifles across their laps. Elias crept behind them, striking one with the butt of his gun, while the twins' arrow cut through the rain, silencing the other. They dragged the bodies aside. Inside, Finch poured whiskey into a tin cup, muttering about fools chasing ghosts. He didn't hear the door creak until Elias stepped in. The older man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Well, hell. Elias Thorne. Thought you'd burned up with your conscience." Elias's voice was steady. "You should have stayed dead to me." Finch laughed. "And miss this? You always were the soft one. Couldn't stomach orders. Couldn't stomach blood." He lifted a revolver from the table, spinning the cylinder. "Guess you came to fix that." And Lee emerged from the shadows, bow drawn. The sight of them made Finch freeze for half a breath, then smirk. "The little savages live. I remember your father screaming." Their arrow trembled, its point steady at his chest. Elias moved closer, his voice sharp. They didn't lower the bow. He burned them alive." Finch sneered. "And you think one arrow makes you clean?" The room seemed to pulse with thunder. Then, from outside, a gunshot cracked. Finch flinched. His own man, panicked, had fired through the doorway. Chaos erupted. Another man burst in, shouting. A second shot rang out. Elias lunged, shoving Mayan Lee aside as a bullet ripped through the wall. The lamp toppled, flames spilling across the floor. Finch turned to run, but one of his men, frightened and greedy, raised his gun. "The gold's mine, old man." The shot hit Finch square in the chest. He fell backward, crashing into the burning table. The others fled into the storm. Mayan Lee stood over the dying man. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then they dropped their bow, the arrow clattering beside the body. "We won't let you take more of us," they whispered. Elias watched the flames curl around the edges of the shack. He found the ledger, a small, water-stained book beside Finch's hand. On one page, in a faded scrawl, he saw a name, Lin, taken to Santa Fe. He turned to Mayan Lee. "Your mother." They looked at the words, their expressions unreadable in the flickering firelight. "She's alive maybe," he said. "Or maybe this is the only proof she ever lived." Mayan Lee took the book gently, as though it were made of glass. "Then we follow this trail." Elias nodded. "We will lightning split the sky." He reached out, taking their wrists to pull them from the collapsing shack. For a moment, their hands met, his scarred, her steady, and they ran into the rain together as the roof caved in behind them. They didn't stop until the storm had spent itself. The river roared below, swollen and silver under the breaking dawn. They sat beneath an overhang, soaked and shaking, the ledger resting between them. Elias's voice came, rough with exhaustion. "You could have killed him, we know. Why didn't you?" They looked out at the river, the water catching the first light of morning. "Because hate is easy, and we're done being easy to understand," he exhaled long and slow. "You're stronger than I ever was." Mayan Lee turned toward him, their faces calm, almost soft. "No, you just finally stopped running." He smiled, a small, uncertain, but real smile. As the sun rose, the rain thinned to a mist. The world smelled clean again. They loaded their gear in silence before mounting their horse. Mayan Lee paused. "What will you do now?" they asked. "Keep riding north," he said. "You?" They looked toward the mountains. "Find what's left of our mother." He nodded. "Then that's the same road." They rode out side by side, the wind at their backs, the smell of wet earth following them, a scent of endings and of something just beginning. The road north wound through weeks of silence and sky. The desert slowly gave way to pine, to thin mountain air that smelled of rain and stone. The mountains rose ahead, a land of whispering trees and lonely missions built by hands long gone. By the time they reached the valley, the season had turned. Wildflowers pressed through the cracks of old trails, and the rivers ran clear from melted snow. Mayan Lee rode slightly ahead now, their hair unbound, the silver bracelet flashing in the sunlight with every movement of their wrists. Elias followed behind, his beard untrimmed, his clothes mended more by their hands than his own. They spoke little, yet each night by the fire, their silences said more than words. They had stopped flinching when the flames cracked. He had stopped waking in the dark, gasping from dreams of burning tents. The mission appeared one morning through a curtain of fog, a modest chapel of adobe and timber, its bell tower leaning to one side. An old woman tended the small garden beside it, humming to herself as she cut herbs. When Mayan Lee called out, the woman straightened slowly, turning her head. Her hair was silver white, her face lined but strong. And though one eye was clouded with blindness, the other fixed sharply on the girls approaching. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the woman dropped her shears and took a halting step forward. "My? Lee?" The names trembled out of her like a prayer forgotten too long. They stopped mid-path. The world seemed to sway, their throats too tight to speak. Then they nodded once. The woman's hands rose, weathered and shaking, as they found her daughter's faces. She traced the lines of their cheeks, the curve of their jaws, and whispered, "They said none survived. But I knew. I knew the son does not die." Mayan Lee fell into their mother's arms, silent tears cutting paths through the dust on their skin. Elias turned away, giving them the privacy of grief too sacred to witness. Later, inside the chapel, Mai and Li sat beside their mother while the older woman spoke softly of years lost, of being taken north by traders, sold to missionaries who gave her shelter but never let her leave. Her sight had faded, but her memory hadn't. "And your brother?" Mai and Li asked. The old woman's lips trembled. "He was taken east. Texas," they said. "A boy too young to fight, too wild to tame." The twins bowed their heads. Then he's still somewhere under the same sky. Their mother reached for their hands. "The land remembers what men forget. If he still breathes, the wind will carry him to you." Elias stood in the doorway, watching as dawn filtered through the stained glass, painting the three women in red and gold. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he stepped forward, holding out a small object wrapped in cloth. "The ledger," he said. "It's yours now." Mai and Li took it gently, their eyes flickering with gratitude. "You found what you came for," they said. "Forgiveness?" He shook his head. "Not forgiveness. Just the courage to live without it." Their lips curved into a faint smile. "Then maybe that's what forgiveness really is." Days passed. Elias helped mend the mission's corral fence and repaired the chapel door. He found peace in the rhythm of honest work again, this time not to erase the past, but to shape something after it. Mai and Li spent their mornings in the hills, gathering herbs with their mother. Their laughter, rare and low, echoed through the pines. In the evenings, they returned to the mission grounds, sitting nearby as Elias worked. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. One night, they brought a small notebook, the same one they'd written in since they left the hollow, and read aloud by lantern light. "Not everyone we seek still waits ahead, but the road is lighter when someone walks beside you." They closed the book, glancing toward him. "You taught us that." Elias smiled, faint lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. "Then I finally built something worth keeping." A week later, as they prepared to leave, Mai and Li stood beside the river that ran behind the mission. The water shimmered with morning light, the same light that had once burned their world to ash. They dipped their hands into it, feeling its chill, its strength. When they turned, Elias was on the bank, hammering the final nail into a new horseshoe for his mare. Sparks flew, catching briefly in his beard before fading. They watched him a moment, then crossed the river stones toward him. "Do you remember what we said in the hollow?" they asked. "That I'd regret buying you," he said with a crooked smile. "And that we'd never obey you." He looked up. "You haven't." They reached into their satchel, pulled out 6 silver coins, tarnished, their edges worn smooth, and set them on a nearby stump. "Then we're paying you back." He frowned. "For what?" "For the fire you stopped. For the road you shared. For not asking us to be anything but ourselves." He touched one coin, then their hands. "You don't owe me. We know," they said softly. "That's why it matters." The sky that evening burned the color of iron and blood from the ridge above. The mountains glowed red in the dying sun, their peaks scarred but beautiful, like wounds that had learned to heal. Elias stood beside them, the scent of worn leather and pine mixing in the air. They looked toward the horizon, their voices quiet. When people see scars, they think of pain. But the land has them, too, and it still breathes. He nodded, following their gaze. "Scars mean it lived." They turned to him, a rare, small smile ghosting across their lips. "Then so do we." The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with fire. In its reflection on the river below, the world seemed to burn again, but this time it was a gentle, cleansing flame. And for the first time since the hollow, all of them let it burn.